If you can go ahead and begin opening up your Bibles to Joshua chapter 3 is where we'll be today. I'm sure it's a story that's very familiar to hopefully all of you, but it's also a one that no matter how many times I read it, I always am amazed at the different things I find in that story. But first, by way of both introduction of myself and introduction to the message, I just wanted to share a little bit of an illustration from my own personal life. As most of you probably know by now, at least those of you who were able to come yesterday to the meals that were shared here. Sorry, I'm going to switch these. This one? Yeah, okay. I like to have it be able to bend like that. All right. So for those of you who were here yesterday and able to get to know us a little bit and during the times of fellowship, you probably heard that I am a missionary kid who was born and raised in West Africa. And my parents still work over there. They're currently in the States. But I'm a missionary kid, born and raised in West Africa. One of the biggest turning points in my life was in 2009 and 10 when I was about 13. My family was here in the States on one of our year-long furloughs at the time when we heard that Muslim terrorists were trying to take over our home country in Africa. We postponed our return overseas for 6 months, but things just got worse over there. So we went to the neighboring country and helped some fellow missionaries for a year while we waited for the situation to calm down. But it only got worse. The terrorists getting closer to our hometown. Soon afterwards, we heard that they had finally reached our town, found our home, and destroyed everything we had left there. 3 generations worth. My grandfather and grandmother were the ones that started the work. Both me and my father had been raised in the same house. They turned our house, the house my grandfather had built, the house that both my father and myself had grown up in, into the courthouse for their Sharia law, where they carried out stonings for adultery, amputations for thievery, and other such punishments. God had shut the door to returning to our home. During this same time period, the mission board we had been working with for 3 generations ran into some financial problems and eventually had to dissolve completely. Sometimes the trials we face in life are such that we have no idea what will happen or where to turn. These are the times that blind steps of faith are required to grow in our walk with the Lord. And that's what I want to share with you this morning. I titled my message, Steps of Faith in the Rivers of Life. And again, I'm sure you can see how that fits into the passage we're going to look at. Again, just to give some more context, during that time of trial that my family went through, there were times that I knew that my parents didn't know what was going to happen, sometimes day to day or week to week. We were just living on our trust in God and His provision through the mission board that had dissolved, and that whole situation, not knowing when we'd be able to return to Africa. And so that was a very trying time, mainly for my parents. I was only 13 at the time, but 13 is also when I was baptized and finalized my faith. I was saved at the age of 5, had doubts to the age of 13, but I finalized my faith at the age of 13. I had just been baptized before all of this happens. And for me, my baptism was both a personal and public declaration that I know I have to make my faith personal. I can't just follow in the footsteps of my parents and go with the motions my whole life. This has to become personal to me. And I think it was God's moving in my life that made these events transpire right after that. And these events that we went through really laid the foundations for my own personal faith and how I view God and how He works in our lives. So let's look at this passage, Joshua 3, verses 9 to 17. The main theme here is God tests the faith of the promised generation of Israel. And the primary takeaway I want us to have today, if there's one thing you take home, I want it to be this. We must always be ready and willing to take steps of blind faith in our walk with the Lord when tested through trials. And trials are the most prominent time when this becomes real and this becomes needed. But it could also, you may also need to take steps of faith when just facing a life decision, or someone is ill in your family and you don't know where to go, what doctors to go to, or what medicine to take. It could be any variety of things that leads us to needing to take a step of faith. And we know that our faith should be an ongoing thing through our entire relationship with God. But sometimes there's times where He's quiet. The teacher is quiet when you're taking the test. And so when God doesn't seem to be answering right away or giving you a clear black and white yes or no answer of where to go, sometimes you just need to take that first step before he begins to part the waters and show you a path. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Just to give some context in the passage before we read it, Joshua has just been appointed the new leader of the children of Israel after they have completed their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. This is the new generation that was born during the wilderness wandering. This generation had not seen the crossing of the Red Sea, most likely, and had been promised that they would be the ones to conquer the new land. So if you remember the history of the Pentateuch up to this point, the generation that crossed the Red Sea, they went through this vicious cycle of complaining. God granted them their wishes. They were happy for a time, but then they started complaining again, and he would judge them. And we know that there were two accounts in which Moses dealt with a rock and giving the people water. The first time, the Lord told him to strike the rock and give the people water, and it happened. But the second time, the complaining just got on Moses' nerves so much that God told him to just speak to the rock to try to give an elevated demonstration of God's power and their faith. But out of spite and anger, Moses lost his temper and struck the rock rather than spoke to it. And because of that simple act of disobedience, God condemned this entire nation, this entire generation, including Moses, and said that they would not be able to enter the promised land. Rather, their children and grandchildren would. So this generation that we're looking at now is those grandchildren, those children and grandchildren, the new generation. Most likely, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who were faithful and trusted God, they will still be able to enter the promised land. So, if we looked at the context, just quickly looking up to this passage in chapters 1 and 2, chapter 1, God speaks to Joshua as the new leader of Israel and gives him the command to cross the Jordan River. So this is really Joshua's first experience as the sole leader of the children of Israel after Moses' death. In chapter 2, Joshua sent the two spies to Jericho who are harbored by Rahab the harlot. And again, that's a story that I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with. So here, in chapter 3, Israel is about to cross the Jordan. Joshua has already received instructions from God and is now relaying those instructions to the people. So let's go ahead and read through this chapter. We're going to be focusing on verses 9 through 17, but I do want to read the whole chapter just for contextual sake. So, chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Acacia Grove and came to the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they crossed over. So it was, after 3 days, that the officers went through the camp, and they commanded the people, saying, When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. And Joshua said to the people, Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Then Joshua spoke to the priests, saying, Take up the ark of the covenant and cross over before the people. So they took up the ark of the covenant and went before the people. And the Lord said to Joshua, This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, saying, When you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan. So Joshua said to the children of Israel, Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out before you the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, and the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Quite a mouthful there. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap. So it was, when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, when the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people. And as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped into the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zaraton. So the waters that went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So, again, a story I'm sure we're all very familiar with. But as we look at this, there's some things I want to draw out that when I read this a while ago, some things started popping out to me that I never noticed before. And that's the joy and beauty of God's Word. You can read it time and time again, and every time you read it, God can show you something different. And there's one thing, especially in this passage that we'll get to about halfway through, that I like to call the little golden nuggets that God throws in there. God has a sense of humor, and he puts things in there that sometimes you tend to breeze over, but then when it pops out to you, it's like, whoa, that brings this whole passage to a whole new life and meaning in your eyes. And so I'm really excited to share this with you guys. This has become one of my favorite passages. So, first of all, today we're going to be looking at a 3-part process of taking steps of faith in the rivers of life. And that first step is obviously preparation for faith. The preparation for faith. And we see this in verses 9 through 13. So in verse 9, we see a command to listen. Verse 9 says, "So Joshua said to the children of Israel, 'Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God.'" So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring out a point and then give a point of application. How do we apply that? And I'm going to give application throughout the message, and then at the end we'll wrap it all together. So Joshua is telling the people, come here, drop what you're doing, and give purposeful attention to what the Lord has to say. And when it comes to our lives, we have to listen and be open to the words of the Lord. You cannot multitask when it comes to listening to God. I've found this out so many times in my own life. When I struggle to have my own personal devotional time each day with the Lord, sometimes I say, I'll just listen to my Bible app while I'm working, or something like that. But yes, it can be encouraging. Yes, it can help. You just don't, it's not the same. You can't get the same thing out of it. And it makes me think of in the New Testament where Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray, and he says, when you pray to God, go into your closet, shut the door, and pray to God. He's saying, shut out the world, drop everything, do not multitask. In order to get the full privilege and benefit of your relationship with God, you have to give him your full and undivided attention. So that's what Joshua is telling the people here. Come here, stop whatever you're doing, and come listen to what God has to say. So I think that's something we can learn from this first verse. Next we see the command to let God show his sovereignty in verse 10. Verse 10 says, "And Joshua said, 'By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you that list of enemies.'" I'm not going to say that again. So Joshua is telling them, you've already seen how God has provided for you, but God is going to prove to you yet again, because we know how fickle these people were, we know how fickle we are. He's going to prove to you yet again his power and his sovereignty, and that he is going before you and paving the way for you. And so in this point we see the command to let God show his sovereignty. If we allow God to work, it will prove to us his omnipotence and sovereignty. We need to stop taking things into our own hands. When you try to manipulate God's will, and that was even mentioned in the adult Sunday school this morning about the Crusades and how the Roman Catholic Church was trying to dictate what God's will was, and they could do anything because, this is God's will. But you can't do that. When you try to take God's will into your own hands, things do not go well. And we can see that from history. I'm sure we can all look back on our own lives and look at times where we tried to do what we wanted to do and try to bring excuses into it, saying it was God's will, but it really wasn't, and it did not end well. And so that's a very important point here. We need to stop taking things into our own hands. We need to fully trust and know that he is able, like the verse I shared before our songs this morning, he is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that you ask or think. And we need to constantly remind ourselves of that. If we allow God to work, it will prove to us his omnipotence and sovereignty. And I want to be clear that I'm being very careful in the way I use the word allow here. I'm not saying that God needs your permission to work in your life. Even if you are straying from him and not as close to him in your relationship as you should be, he will still be working in your life. And we even saw that this morning in talking about the Crusades. Even though that was a terrible time and most people think of it as a negative thing, there were still people and events that God was working through to grow his church. He didn't stop working just because most people weren't doing his will. God can still work in your life even if you weren't at that moment close to him. But what I mean by saying allow is be open to it, be sensitive to his leading. And when you are, I like to think of it of either closed fists or open hands. If you are coming to God with open hands and saying, use any part of my life, have everything I have and use it for your glory, you will be able to see him work in ways you never could imagine. And so that's what Joshua is telling the people here. God is about to do something, but you have to be open to that possibility. You have to be open to his working in your life. If you're going to get to where he has promised you, it's a two-way road. Every relationship is a two-way road, and God's going to work no matter what, but you have to do your part too. So if we allow God to work, it will prove to us his omnipotence and sovereignty. Be open to his plans. His plans are higher than our plans. So next we see a reminder of God's promises. Let's see, there's three of them up there. A reminder of God's promises. Verse 11, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over before you into the Jordan. And where we see a reminder of God's promises here is you have to know the history of the ark of the covenant. This was the most physical, tangible symbol they had of God's presence at the time. And we know that at times they tended to idolize that. But this was just the detail and intentionality that went into the making of this thing. Just that alone shows how sacred this was to them. And this Ark of the Covenant was the physical reminder in front of them that God is going before us. And that's why throughout the history of Israel using the Ark of the Covenant, you always see that the Ark and the priests went before the people. They always went first. Because that was supposed to be a physical reminder that God has already been through this trial. God has already been through this battle, and he's already won. And all you need to do is follow his leading. So this was a reminder of God's promises, that he has promised to go before them. This ark was the most holy symbol of God's presence. Just, again, its construction, and we know that they were not allowed to touch it. It was that holy. The priests had to use poles going through rings, and they were only allowed to touch the poles. They never touched the actual ark. And so how often do we let the sacredness of who Christ is and the fact that he's gone before us fall away in our lives? And how often do we forget that he has gone before us and he's already won the battle? And I think it's a good idea, even though we know we aren't supposed to have idols or images or whatever. There's that whole debate in the history of the church. I think it's a good idea to have physical reminders around your home, just Bible verses hanging on the wall. And I've really enjoyed seeing that here at the church. We have Bible verses at the bottom of the stairs, places you see it often when you're walking, just physical reminders of God's presence in your life. And that should be very important in our lives as Christians. Next we see the importance of having godly leaders and mentors in verse 12. Now therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from every tribe. And then if we were to go further and look into chapter 4, it talks about the memorial stones, and that they took stones, one man from every tribe. They chose a leader. That leader went out and chose a large stone. They kept it in their tent the night before they crossed the Jordan. And then the next day, after the people had crossed, those men took those stones back, and while the priests were still standing in the river, they took those stones back and made a monument, basically a giant altar, as a reminder to further generations of God's faithfulness and what he did for them there. And so God was showing them the importance of choosing men that you look up to, that you respect, that you see as leaders, and use them as examples and guides in your walk with God. And so I think that's very important for us today. Obviously, churches have pastors and deacons and elders, and those are the men that the church as a whole look to guide them and to to point them to Christ. And yes, those men are still to be kept accountable to the Bible because they're just as human as everyone. But I think it's also important to surround yourself with godly friends, godly peers, but also if you need accountability in something or you're going through a hard time, it's best to find godly people who maybe are older than you, have some wisdom that you have not experienced yet, have some years on you, and look for their wisdom and encouragement. And we see that example throughout the history of the people of Israel. They surrounded themselves with godly leaders, sometimes not so godly, and they learned their lesson through that. But again, we have the Bible and history to give an example to us of how to do these things that will help us prepare to take steps of faith. All of these things are things that that God can use to show us that step of faith. He can speak through a mentor. He can speak through His word or prayer when you're listening and giving Him your full attention. He can speak through His sovereignty in other situations that you look back and see how He worked. He can use that to show you a current answer or path. And so all of these things are things that you can use to try to determine God's will when facing a rushing river in your life. So we see the importance of having godly leaders and mentors. Follow their example. As long as they are following the example of the Bible, follow them. They are there to help you. God has put them in your life for a reason. And finally, under this preparation for faith, we see God's faithful response to obedience. As soon as we take steps of faith in obedience to His commands, God will begin to work. And again, He's working all the time, no matter what, even when we're not following Him. But again, if you are living in obedience, if you are in the center of His will, you will be able to see Him work and appreciate that to the maximum effectiveness, and it will mean that much more to you. You will get that much more out of the experience if you are obeying Him in the process. And we see that in verse 13, where it says, "And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, and the waters that come down from upstream, they shall stand as a heap." So we see that God promised, as soon as the bottoms of the feet, not like as soon as they're all four stepping in up to their ankles or knees, no, as soon as they barely touch the surface of the water, God's going to move and move the waters aside for you. And so it was the simplest act of faith that they had to take, a very minute detail, but sometimes that's all it takes to see God working in your life. So I think that this is a really good example of, again, the two-way road that those of you who are married, those of you who are maybe dating, or in even just a good friendship with another person, any good, healthy relationship is a two-way road. It's a give and take. One person can't just sit back and make the other person do everything. You've got to be there for each other. And how much more important is that in a relationship with God? And yes, we know He is always faithful. He never gives up. But we need to constantly remind ourselves we need to be giving to Him and doing our part in obeying Him and following Him. And when we do that, that relationship will be at the healthiest spot it can be. And you will be able to get the most out of your relationship with God. So that pretty much covers the preparations for faith in verses 9 to 13. This is all the instructions. This is Joshua giving them the instructions. Here's the steps to take. Here's what you need to be doing and thinking as we move forward to see God work, to take this next step in the path He has for us. So this was the preparations for faith. And next we see the practice of faith in verses 14 to 16. First, we see that we must faithfully obey God's instructions. And again, this is just illustrating the two-way road. 14 and 15. "So it was, when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priest bearing the ark of the covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream," and so on. So we see that it's very simple. They did what God told them to do, and God did what He said He would do. And so when we obey God's commands, He can He can be that much more effective in showing us His power. And secondly, we see that God will faithfully keep His promises. So I have a couple other verses here that I want to look at. First of all, Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. We must faithfully obey God's instructions is illustrated in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. Says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And so here in Isaiah, God is telling the prophet that I'm God. If you understood my ways and if we understand what God's going to do and how he works, he wouldn't be God. And so we need to remind ourselves of that his ways are so much higher than our ways. He has a plan, even though we may not see it 100% of the time. And so we get nowhere if we try to control God's will or his plan. Just look at the previous generation of Israel. That's exactly what they tried to do. They tried to complain and say, no, we deserve this. This is what you should do for us, God. And he punished them and over again because of their complaining and unwillingness to submit to his will and his plans. And so, again, through history, and I'm sure we can see it in our own lives, that's not how God works. He doesn't work according to your ideas. He's not a God of logic. Trust me, I've seen it. There are times in my life I still don't know how or why God did certain things, but I trust that he has a bigger picture in mind. And then secondly, we see God will faithfully keep his promises. And the verse for that is James chapter 4 and the first part of verse 8. And this is a very well-known verse. James chapter 4, in verse 8 says, "Draw nigh to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse you heart, you sinners." And then another phrase I wasn't able to find as quickly as I hoped. But it's talking about if you draw near to God, he will draw near to you. Again, just that two-way road, put very plainly and simply, that as long as you are seeking to be in the center of his will, he will be closer to you and work that much more powerfully in your life. And when we're in the center of his will and obeying him, yes, we'll go through hard trials and he will test us, and that can be a good thing. But if you are in the center of his will, that means you're avoiding his punishment and his wrath and his justice, which sometimes is much more severe than the tests he will put you through. Because if you're going through a test in the right faith, you won't be focusing on the negative parts of that test and how severe it is. You'll be focusing on what God can be teaching you through that. So this brings us to what I call the golden nugget of this passage, the hinge, the thing that really brought this to life for me, and I hope you get just as excited about this as I do. But just look at verse 15 that we just read. And if you read through verse 15 real quick, there's something there that when you're reading through, you'd probably, especially because it's in parentheses, you would probably tend to just breeze over it and not even think twice about it. But that's what I think brings this whole picture into perspective. In verse 15, it says, "For the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest." So what do you think that's saying? That's saying that God had the children of Israel cross the Jordan when it was at its fullest and most frightening. This was during, and I've seen this in Africa, we don't have like summer, fall, winter, spring. We have rainy season and dry season, or hot season and cold season, because we don't get snow or anything. And so for us, rainy season, it can change year to year. Sometimes it's close to a drought and we have hardly any rain. Other years we've had water holes flood right up to the borders of our property and had to cross rushing river in our four-wheel drive Toyota Land Cruiser with the water right up to the windows and everything. And so we have seen and even crossed scary looking rivers that we didn't think we'd make it across. But that's what God is making them do. He had them come to this Jordan River at the time it was overflowing, because it was harvest time, and it was the time that all the rains were just pounding the earth and flooding the rivers. And so this was a very ferocious and scary looking river for them. But isn't it cool how God just put that in parentheses, like, oh, by the way, I had him do it this time. I made it hard for him. And again, God's sense of humor that I love to see as we study the Bible. He wanted to prove his power to them in the face of overwhelming odds. And how many times do we pass up opportunities to see that? How many times do we shy away from the trials and reject it and go down a path that God did not intend for us? And we miss out on seeing His power. Sorry, I get emotional because it just brings to mind all the things I've seen on the mission field and how God has provided for our family. In a way, and another cool thing about this is, in a way, this was an opportunity for this younger generation who had not seen the crossing of the Red Sea to experience, even though on a smaller scale, what their parents had experienced. You know the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. That was an entire sea that probably took them a whole day or more to cross, because we're talking thousands of people. We're not talking a group like this. We're talking thousands of people. And so there may be even more people now, because these are the children and grandchildren of the ones that crossed the Red Sea. And so this is an even larger group of people, most likely, crossing the Jordan. And so this was not an easy task or easy feat, but nothing's too hard for our God. That should be obvious. And so, in a way, this was an opportunity for this younger generation to experience, on a smaller scale, what their parent. I'm sure they had heard stories about it over the campfire, and those who told stories about just the incredible miracle of a whole entire sea parting and crossing on dry ground. And so these kids and grandkids had heard these stories, and this was their chance to finally experience it for themselves. And so I think that's a really cool illustration in this passage as well. So just to put it in perspective for us, I went online and just Googled some pictures of Israelites crossing the Jordan. And like the storybooks that the kids have maybe in the nursery or at home, the Bible storybooks and the pictures with the cartoon characters, this is quite often what you might see. Things like this, and I'm going to back out of the way. Things like this. And so, I'm sorry for the quality. You can only get so good when you just Google pictures. But you see this water here, it's hardly doing anything. It's just kind of sitting there, and you can see it starting to part as they walk in. So that part's legit. But here it's just sitting there like a calm beach and everything. It's not rushing and scary. Here's another example. This is a little more realistic to how wide it was, so they could all cross. And you can see that's pretty high, but it's still like glassy on top, real calm, and there's hardly anything going on. And then finally, probably the most childish is this cartoon picture. Again, just a very calm stream that they're crossing. That is not the case. It was probably more like this. Whitewater rapids, rushing, scary, rocks and things you have to cross and everything. And coming from Appalachian Bible College, I've been on all of the rapids there. I've been whitewater rafting 4 times. And this stuff, to me, it looks fun because I've been on it and it's an exciting thing. But if you have to cross that with animals and children and carts and wagons and who knows what else, that's scary. It makes me think of the Western videos when you watch the Western movies where the wagon trains that had to cross the river, and like almost every time you had some sort of casualty, whether it was animals or a wagon losing wheels. That would be scary. But if you read this, God takes all of those negative and scary variables out of the way for them and makes it the safest possible situation that they could cross. And so as we continue to look at this, let's look at the product of faith. What did God do because they took this step of faith? Verse 17. Then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So that last phrase makes it clear. All the people made it. No one died. No one got stuck in the mud because there was no mud. Because it says there was dry ground. If you dammed up a river or a stream or something, or you drain a man-made pond or something, it's going to take days to dry out. It's not going to be dry like that. It's going to be muddy and you wouldn't want to walk in that right away. But this says that God immediately made it bone dry and firm and easy for them to cross so that no one got stuck in the mud. It did not slow them down at all. And so that was, this is a miracle within a miracle within a miracle. God's doing so many things here that we just tend to breeze over and not see. But he's doing so much that should be a huge testimony to his power and provision. So how do we apply this to ourselves? First of all, we will stand safe and firm if we are in the center of God's will. I believe it was Corrie ten Boom and her sister who were, they helped Jews escape during Nazi Germany, but they themselves ended up being in a Nazi prison camp. And I believe it was during their time there at the Nazi prison camp, they were caring for the other prisoners and witnessing and singing praises to God. during the incredibly horrendous situations and environment that they were in. And yet they chose not to focus on their negative circumstances, but chose to focus on still being a light to others and helping others and encouraging them in the Lord. And I think it was during that time that Corrie ten Boom or her sister was quoted as saying, the will of God will not take you where the grace of God cannot keep you. And so if you are in the center of God's will and you know you're where he wants you, then again, there is nothing that can happen to you. What can man do to me? If God is for me, who can be against me? Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. You can just quote things left and right that prove this point. We will stand safe and firm in the center of God's will. If you are in the center of God's will, he will provide. This is the worst I've been on this sermon. He will provide the dry ground for you to walk on. And so do what you can to prepare yourself in your faith and keep yourself in the center of God's will. And secondly, we see we will be able to most effectively carry out the plans he has for us. And again, that's what I mean when I say allow God to work. Be living in a way that makes it easier for you to see him work. It's not hard or easy for God to work. He's always working. But if you are open to his leading, you will be able to most effectively carry out his plans and most effectively see his power.